This was not only a period of transition for my family, it marked one of the most uncertain moments the monarchy had faced in generations. Throughout history, the crown had survived abdications, bitter family conflicts, exile, scandals, and periods of profound national grief. Every crisis had tested the institution, yet it had always managed to endure. Even so, nothing in recent royal history had prepared Britain for the extraordinary announcement Prince William delivered behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace. With King Charles facing growing health concerns, the future of the succession attracting intense scrutiny, and divisions quietly widening among senior members of the royal family, William made a decision that would permanently reshape the line of inheritance. Standing before the gathered royals, he formally declared that his eldest son, Prince George, would carry the title of Crown Prince of Britain, a designation unlike any held by a modern heir in recent times. From that moment onward, the direction of the monarchy entered entirely new territory. Before we examine the full significance of this unprecedented decision and its consequences for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another important update. The meeting itself had been called without advance notice. Invitations were delivered quietly, offering no explanation beyond the instruction that attendance was essential. Catherine arrived beside William, composed but visibly aware of the seriousness surrounding the gathering. Princess Anne entered separately, her expression calm yet cautious. Queen Camilla followed under similar arrangements, escorted through another entrance to maintain complete privacy. This was not a ceremonial occasion, nor was it a routine family discussion. Buckingham Palace had assembled its senior figures because the stability of the monarchy itself had become the central concern. The succession, the carefully protected system through which the crown passes from one sovereign to the next, had reached a point where immediate action was considered necessary. William wasted no time with formalities. His manner remained measured, but every word carried unmistakable authority. He placed his pen beside an emergency royal declaration, a constitutional instrument reserved only for situations considered capable of threatening institutional continuity. Looking directly toward George, William delivered the announcement without hesitation. His eldest son would now be recognized as Crown Prince of Britain, identified as the protected future of the monarchy beyond William's own eventual reign. He explained that George would no longer simply wait quietly as the next generation of royalty. From this point forward, his education, security, responsibilities, and preparation would receive heightened protection under a carefully structured royal framework. The room fell silent. George offered no smile or visible celebration. Instead, he tightened his grip on the chair before him and instinctively looked toward his mother. Like any 11-year-old confronted with overwhelming responsibility, he searched Catherine's face for reassurance rather than recognition. She answered with only a gentle nod. Her expression reflected both pride and quiet concern. She understood exactly why William believed such action had become necessary. At the same time, she also understood the enormous personal cost the decision might place upon their son before he was mature enough to fully understand what had changed. King Charles accepted the document and slowly examined every line. Rather than responding immediately, he read the declaration a second time, absorbing not only its language but its constitutional implications. When he finally lowered the pages, he remained silent. The king recognized that William had acted with the intention of protecting the institution. Yet the declaration also represented an important shift in practical authority. It demonstrated that the heir to the throne had taken extraordinary steps to secure the dynasty during a period of uncertainty. Queen Camilla noticed another significant detail. Her name did not appear among the official witnesses listed in support of the declaration. Within royal procedure, those witnesses represented individuals formally associated with endorsing the action. The omission immediately signaled that this announcement accomplished more than elevating George's future position. It also narrowed the group expected to influence the monarchy during the next generation. Without speaking, Camilla understood that important boundaries had quietly been redrawn. The silence was eventually broken by Princess Anne. Referring to an official council statement placed before the king, she confirmed that William's decision relied upon an emergency constitutional provision that had existed for years but had remained dormant. The clause had been created specifically for moments when continuity of the crown appeared vulnerable. William had not invented new authority. Instead, he had prepared carefully to activate powers already embedded within royal procedure. As the formal meeting concluded, the participants quietly departed the chamber one by one. Before William could leave, however, King Charles instructed him to remain behind. The heavy doors closed, leaving father and son alone, with the declaration resting between them. Although George had officially received an extraordinary title, the House of Windsor had simultaneously reopened emotional divisions that years of careful restraint had attempted to keep buried. Outside those walls, the public would soon view Prince George as the most carefully protected young royal in Britain. Headlines would focus on titles, succession, and constitutional symbolism. Inside the family, however, another reality remained impossible to ignore. George was still an 11-year-old child, being asked to carry expectations that had challenged experienced monarchs throughout history. William believed he had fulfilled his duty by strengthening the future of the crown. Catherine worried about preserving her son's childhood before royal responsibility consumed it. Charles recognized echoes of earlier generations repeating themselves once again. At the center of every conversation stood George himself, surrounded by advisors, tradition, history, and overwhelming expectation. Despite every title placed before him, one difficult truth remained impossible to escape. His future had become inseparable from the monarchy, and from that day onward, much of his life would no longer belong entirely to him. William never regarded the declaration as an expression of personal ambition. In his eyes, it represented protection rather than power. Having spent his own childhood under relentless media attention, enduring family conflict and the devastating loss of Princess Diana, he understood how uncertainty inside the monarchy could leave lasting emotional scars. He refused to allow George to experience that same instability without stronger safeguards. Catherine understood his reasoning completely, yet her concerns centered elsewhere. She supported securing their son's future, but believed the responsibility had arrived before George possessed the emotional maturity to comprehend its true weight. To her, the title of Crown Prince of Britain represented far more than ceremonial recognition. It identified him as the institution's officially protected future, placing his upbringing under systems traditionally directed by senior royal authority. While others focused on succession, protocol, and constitutional continuity, Catherine remained determined to protect something far more fragile: the ordinary child still living beneath an extraordinary title. Later that evening, after the palace corridors had fallen quiet and the official meeting had ended, Catherine searched for George. She eventually found him sitting alone in a private room, with the ceremonial folder resting unopened on the table before him. The documents that had changed his future lay only inches away, yet he showed little interest in reading them. His thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Rather than asking about the significance of his new title, the traditions that accompanied it, or the ceremonies that awaited him, George asked a far simpler question. He wanted to know whether becoming crown prince meant he now had to behave differently around Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. The question caught Catherine by surprise because it revealed what truly mattered to him. He was not worried about duty or public expectations. He was worried about his family. Catherine quietly took the seat beside him. Speaking with the calm reassurance only a mother could offer, she promised that no royal declaration, no constitutional document, and no title would ever change the bond they shared as a family. She explained that Charlotte and Louis would always know him first as their brother, regardless of what the public called him. Titles belonged to the institution, she said, but love belonged to the family. George listened carefully, yet the uncertainty in his expression remained. Deep inside, he sensed that something important had changed, even if no one wanted to admit exactly how much. Only a few moments later, William entered the room. Before anyone spoke, he immediately recognized the emotional distance that had settled over his son. George looked toward his father with unusual seriousness, before asking the question that every adult in the palace had quietly hoped the children would avoid. "Does this mean something is wrong with Grandpa?" The words hung in the room. William did not answer immediately. His brief silence lasted only a few seconds, but for George, it was long enough to confirm that the announcement had not happened without reason. The future king finally explained that the monarchy always had to prepare for every possibility, especially during uncertain times. Even so, George understood that preparations of this magnitude did not appear without cause. The title had not been created out of celebration alone. It had emerged because the adults believed the future required stronger protection. King Charles experienced that same reality from a very different perspective. During a confidential discussion with Princess Anne later that evening, the king privately admitted that George's elevation had altered the emotional landscape of his own reign. Although he understood William's intentions, the declaration reminded him that history continued moving forward regardless of personal feelings. For the first time, Charles sensed that the institution had begun preparing for a future in which his influence might gradually diminish more quickly than anyone had publicly acknowledged. It was not merely a constitutional adjustment, it felt deeply personal. Elsewhere inside the palace, Queen Camilla sought immediate clarification. She requested detailed explanations regarding the practical consequences of George's new status. Would he now begin receiving constitutional briefings that introduced him to the relationship between the Crown and Parliament? Would he gain access to secure royal residences, confidential state information, and ceremonial responsibilities traditionally reserved for those closest to the sovereign? Her questions demonstrated that she clearly understood the broader implications of the declaration. This was not simply an honorary distinction, it represented the beginning of an entirely new stage in George's preparation. Princess Anne responded by referring to an official council briefing prepared for senior members of the royal household. According to the document, responsibility for George's future education and preparation would now fall under a specially protected council operating under the direct guidance of William and Catherine. The framework covered every aspect of his development, including education, security, ceremonial training, and future constitutional responsibilities. Most importantly, the council would function independently. Membership, funding decisions, and scheduling authority would no longer be directed through offices traditionally associated with the sovereign's household. The structure ensured that George's parents remained the principal decision-makers throughout his upbringing. Camilla immediately understood what that meant. Her influence over the process would be significantly reduced. Later that night, King Charles examined an earlier version of the declaration more closely. As he reviewed the paperwork, one detail immediately caught his attention. The original draft carried a date several weeks earlier than the emergency meeting itself. The realization was impossible to ignore. William had not created the declaration overnight. It had existed quietly in preparation long before the family gathered inside Buckingham Palace. The king now wanted to know what specific event had convinced his son that the time had finally come to activate it. The answer reached back to an evening that had initially appeared completely ordinary. The emergency declaration had not originated during constitutional discussions or private meetings between senior advisors. Instead, its roots could be traced to an elegant royal banquet where formal speeches, diplomatic conversations, and carefully rehearsed protocol concealed growing disagreement beneath the surface. For weeks, tensions surrounding George's future had steadily increased. William believed decisions involving his son's public appearances, educational schedule, security arrangements, and ceremonial participation belonged primarily to George's parents. Others within the sovereign's household viewed those same responsibilities differently. From their perspective, George represented the future of the monarchy, making such decisions matters of institutional importance rather than purely parental authority. With each additional instruction issued through palace offices, William felt that control over his son's childhood was slowly shifting away from the family. Princess Anne recognized the pattern before most others did. During a confidential briefing, she presented William with evidence showing that George's ceremonial education had gradually expanded without Catherine's formal approval. Concerned about the long-term consequences, Anne assisted William in developing a protective succession framework. The proposal established safeguards intended to preserve George's constitutional future while ensuring that William and Catherine retained primary authority over the decisions shaping his childhood. Because everyone understood how politically sensitive the issue had become, the draft remained strictly confidential. Neither William nor Anne wished to ignite an open conflict within the royal family unless circumstances made it unavoidable. Those circumstances arrived during the Commonwealth Unity Banquet. The event had been organized to celebrate the partnership shared among Commonwealth nations. Distinguished guests from across the world attended, expecting an evening defined by diplomacy, tradition, and royal unity. Instead, a single instruction transformed the atmosphere. Without informing William or Catherine beforehand, Queen Camilla's senior private secretary directed that George should leave his parents' table and take a prominent seat beside visiting foreign dignitaries. The explanation was simple. He should be presented as the visible symbol of Britain's future continuity. William had never approved the arrangement. Catherine had received no advance notice. As an attendant quietly approached George's chair, the young prince hesitated in confusion. Before anyone could escort him away, William calmly placed one hand on the back of the chair and stated that his son would remain exactly where he was. The entire banquet hall fell silent. William then asked a single question. Who authorized this change? No immediate answer followed. The hesitation itself spoke volumes. Across the table, Catherine noticed panic spreading across George's face. Without drawing attention, she reached beneath the table, gently took his hand, and held it firmly. Around them, senior palace officials quietly debated protocol, authority, and constitutional tradition. Yet Catherine saw something entirely different. They were discussing her son as though he were already an institution instead of an 11-year-old child. In that unforgettable moment, anxiety gave way to determination. Protecting George's future no longer meant preparing him only for the crown. It also meant protecting the childhood he still had left. The disagreement had moved far beyond questions of ceremony or protocol. What had once been an internal discussion about royal procedure had crossed into the heart of family life, and Prince George had become the person carrying the greatest burden. Every decision made by adults behind palace walls now had a direct impact on an 11-year-old boy who had never asked to become the center of a constitutional debate. The struggle was no longer simply about succession. It had become a conflict over who would shape George's future and under what authority that future would unfold. Queen Camilla firmly defended the events that had taken place during the Commonwealth banquet. From her perspective, asking George to sit among senior international representatives had been a practical step toward preparing him for the responsibilities that would one day accompany the crown. She believed that exposure to diplomacy, ceremony, and public expectation formed an essential part of a future monarch's education. Delaying those experiences, she argued, would only make the transition more difficult later. William rejected that reasoning immediately. He remained calm, but his response carried unmistakable determination. Preparation, he insisted, could never come through decisions made in secret or instructions delivered without the knowledge of George's parents. If his son was expected to grow into a future king, then that journey had to be guided with honesty, transparency, and trust, not through private arrangements negotiated behind closed doors. William believed that George deserved stability before symbolism. Although the discussion was directed toward palace officials, George heard every exchange. For the first time, he realized that adults were disagreeing because of him. The celebration surrounding his new position suddenly felt less like an honor and more like the beginning of something uncertain. The confidence he had seen on official faces earlier in the day had disappeared, replaced by tension that even a child could recognize. In that moment, George understood that the title carried consequences, extending far beyond public ceremonies. When the banquet concluded, Princess Anne quietly approached William. Without attracting attention, she handed him a sealed folder containing several confidential scheduling documents. After reviewing the contents, William's expression changed immediately. The papers revealed 3 additional engagements that had already been arranged for George without parental approval. Among them was a private constitutional briefing, intended to introduce George to future responsibilities, a meeting from which Catherine herself had been excluded. For William, that discovery represented the final warning. The issue was no longer theoretical. Someone had already begun reorganizing George's future without the direct involvement of his parents. That evening, William contacted Princess Anne privately. His instruction was brief and unmistakable. Activate the emergency framework. Those 4 words transformed months of preparation into immediate action. When King Charles later learned what had occurred, he chose not to cancel the existing schedule. Instead, he requested a private meeting with his eldest son. The atmosphere surrounding the banquet had remained outwardly polite, but beneath those formal smiles lay disagreements that could no longer remain unspoken. Father and son would now confront one another directly. The meeting took place without advisors, private secretaries, or constitutional officials. No prepared speeches rested on the table. Only King Charles, Prince William, and the signed declaration separated them. Between those pages lay two entirely different visions for the future of the monarchy. Charles believed that every future sovereign had to be shaped by the institution itself. Throughout history, the crown had survived precisely because each generation inherited not only titles but also carefully managed preparation under the authority of the reigning monarch. Without one coordinated system, Charles feared that separate royal households could gradually evolve into competing centers of influence, weakening unity within the monarchy. William viewed that same system from an entirely different perspective. He believed history had demonstrated the emotional cost of allowing institutional priorities to overshadow family life. Palace tradition, in his opinion, had too often expected individuals to sacrifice personal well-being in service of public image. George, he insisted, would not become another child whose development was directed primarily by palace officials before he fully understood his own identity beyond royal duty. King Charles slowly pushed the declaration across the table. Looking directly at William, he asked a simple but deeply significant question. "Did you ever intend to ask for my permission?" William remained standing. His answer came without hesitation. He explained that he had acted within established constitutional authority. The declaration had been supported by Catherine and reviewed through the proper legal framework with Princess Anne's assistance. Protecting his son, he argued, did not require seeking permission from anyone. The conversation immediately grew more personal. Charles accused William of using George's elevation to signal the beginning of a new era before the current reign had reached its conclusion. To the king, the declaration suggested that attention was already shifting toward the next generation. William's response arrived instantly. "He is not the beginning of my reign." A brief pause followed. "He is my son." The words settled heavily across the room. For Charles, they carried greater emotional weight than any constitutional disagreement. They reminded him that beneath every title remained relationships shaped by love, fear, responsibility, and painful memories stretching back decades. Without anyone mentioning her name directly, memories of Princess Diana entered the discussion. Charles cautioned that excessive protection could eventually become another form of isolation. Shielding George too completely, he argued, might prevent him from developing the resilience necessary to fulfill his future responsibilities. William answered with quiet conviction. He had witnessed firsthand what palace protection had meant during his mother's life. He remembered how public pressure, institutional expectations, and personal isolation had combined with devastating consequences. He refused to watch another generation experience similar emotional hardship simply because tradition demanded it. Charles recognized the accusation immediately. Yet beneath William's words, he also heard lingering grief that had never fully disappeared. After several moments of silence, the king identified what he believed to be the declaration's greatest vulnerability. According to the official record of the meeting, he had never formally approved the specific wording identifying George as Crown Prince of Britain. His silence during the gathering, Charles argued, should not automatically be interpreted as constitutional consent. From his perspective, the declaration remained open to legal interpretation and possible challenge. William was prepared for that argument. He referred to an existing constitutional safeguard known as the Regency Continuity Instrument, a legal mechanism designed to preserve institutional stability during periods involving illness or diminished capacity. The document had previously been signed during confidential reviews concerning continuity planning. Princess Anne had relied upon those established provisions when validating the declaration. The room fell silent once again. King Charles slowly walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he stopped. Without turning back, he asked one final question. Does George truly understand what has been done in his name? For the first time during the meeting, William hesitated. His certainty faded. Despite every legal safeguard, every constitutional argument, and every carefully prepared document, one reality remained impossible to answer completely. George was still only a child. Outside the room, Queen Camilla waited quietly. By then, she understood that the newly established succession council would significantly reduce her influence over decisions involving George's preparation. Rather than accepting those changes without question, she began considering how to respond within the constitutional structures still available to her. The title now officially belonged to Prince George, yet the struggle surrounding that title had only just begun. Inside Buckingham Palace, experienced adults debated authority, tradition, and constitutional responsibility. Beyond the palace gates, the public would see only headlines celebrating the future of the monarchy. At the center of both worlds stood one young boy. George had not sought power. He had not asked to become the focus of competing visions for the crown. But history had placed him there nonetheless, leaving him to grow up under expectations that few adults could fully comprehend. The declaration had secured his place in the future of the monarchy, yet it had also revealed a timeless truth about royal life. Behind every title lies a family, and behind every constitutional decision stand people struggling to balance duty with those they love. Queen Camilla viewed the emergency declaration as far more than a constitutional adjustment. To her, it represented a direct reduction of the authority traditionally exercised through the sovereign's household. Decisions that had once flowed through established royal offices were suddenly being redirected elsewhere, limiting the influence of those who had long participated in shaping the future of the monarchy. From her perspective, the declaration was not simply protecting Prince George, it was restructuring the balance of power within the palace itself. Princess Anne saw the situation very differently. Where others focused on influence, Anne focused on continuity. She believed the declaration existed for one purpose alone, to protect the next generation of the royal family during a period of uncertainty. In her view, safeguarding George's future required placing his upbringing beyond the reach of competing interests, regardless of how uncomfortable that decision might become for senior members of the household. Caught between these opposing viewpoints stood King Charles. The king understood the concerns expressed by his wife, yet he also respected his sister's unwavering commitment to preserving constitutional stability. One side warned that established authority was being weakened. The other insisted that extraordinary measures were necessary to secure the monarchy's future. Charles found himself balancing loyalty to his family with responsibility to the institution he served. Then Princess Anne disclosed one final detail. A single additional signature had transformed the declaration from a temporary measure into one that would be extremely difficult to reverse. The implications became immediately clear. For Queen Camilla, the consequences were deeply personal. Responsibility for George's education, ceremonial development, future household arrangements, constitutional instruction, and succession planning had officially been transferred to a newly established protected family council. This carefully structured body would oversee every major decision concerning the young prince's preparation. Queen Camilla would no longer participate in those discussions. Her role had not gradually diminished. It had been formally removed. Returning to her office, Camilla immediately sensed that the atmosphere had changed. The familiar succession schedules she had regularly reviewed were no longer waiting on her desk. Confidential briefing files that she had previously examined alongside the king had also disappeared. The missing documents represented more than administrative changes. They communicated a message that required no explanation. William no longer believed she should influence decisions regarding George's future. Camilla remained seated in silence. She did not summon staff. She did not request clarification. The absence of the paperwork spoke loudly enough on its own. Later, when she returned to speak with King Charles, she no longer concealed her frustration. She argued that William's actions had embarrassed not only her personally, but also the authority of the reigning monarch. By acting independently, she believed, William had created the impression that preparations for the next era had already begun before the current reign had reached its conclusion. Charles listened carefully. Although he acknowledged William's concerns, he also defended his son's motives. The king admitted that George had gradually become involved in palace decisions without the full participation of his parents. Under those circumstances, he understood why William believed stronger safeguards had become necessary. Yet Charles could not ignore another reality. The moment the declaration became active, A portion of practical authority surrounding George's future shifted away from the sovereign's household. That truth remained impossible to deny. Princess Anne refused to soften her own position. Having accepted responsibility as the senior guardian of the emergency framework, she considered it her duty to ensure that no competing office, household, or individual could alter George's preparation through unofficial influence. Her responsibility was not to protect personalities, it was to protect the constitutional process itself. During an official council discussion, Queen Camilla confronted Anne directly. She questioned whether Anne had supported the creation of George's new title simply to remove her from the decision-making process. Anne answered calmly. She explained that her actions had never been directed against any individual. Instead, they reflected one guiding principle. George required protection from anyone who confused access with constitutional authority. The response ended the personal argument and returned the discussion to institutional responsibility. Anne then presented another important document. Opening the official continuity register, she directed attention to an earlier entry signed by King Charles during a confidential period involving continuity planning. The record demonstrated that the legal authority supporting the emergency framework had been approved before the present disagreement ever began. That detail carried enormous significance. Because the enabling authority already existed, withdrawing it now would inevitably invite questions regarding the circumstances under which it had originally been authorized. Charles immediately recognized the constitutional dilemma. Reversing the framework might expose matters the palace had carefully chosen to keep private. Another document soon strengthened the declaration even further. Attached to the official register was Catherine's written consent. The Princess of Wales confirmed that she had agreed to activate the emergency measures only after the events surrounding the Commonwealth banquet convinced both parents that stronger protection had become necessary. The declaration had therefore not been William's independent initiative. It represented a joint decision made by George's mother and father together. King Charles slowly reached for his pen. For a brief moment, it appeared he might suspend the council entirely. Instead, after several silent seconds, he gently placed the pen back on the table. The king understood that reversing the declaration would almost certainly draw George into an even more public constitutional dispute. Whatever disagreements existed among adults, Charles refused to place his grandson at the center of a prolonged institutional conflict. Before the meeting could continue, an aide entered the room carrying urgent news. The declaration had leaked. Information that had been intended to remain confidential was already spreading beyond palace walls. Within hours, the phrase "Crown Prince" began appearing across television broadcasts, digital news alerts, newspaper websites, and social media discussions throughout Britain. The palace had lost control of the narrative. Ironically, the first victims of the leak were not constitutional authority or political influence. They were 3 children. Before William and Catherine could explain the announcement privately, George's classmates had already begun discussing his new title. Princess Charlotte first learned about the story through another student. Prince Louis noticed unfamiliar crowds gathering outside the family residence. George himself discovered that a decision made behind closed doors had transformed the way strangers viewed him before he had fully understood what it meant for his own life. Recognizing that silence was no longer possible, Buckingham Palace officially confirmed the announcement. Almost immediately, George's security classification was upgraded. His public engagements were suspended. Every planned family appearance entered a revised succession protocol designed to protect those closest to the future of the crown. The practical consequences became visible almost overnight. William and Catherine returned to Windsor earlier than planned, fully aware that one leaked document had transformed their private home into the center of national attention. Palace staff moved quickly to adapt. Confidential briefing folders disappeared from shared areas. Television news alerts were muted whenever the children entered a room. Newspapers carrying the most sensational headlines were quietly removed before breakfast. Every effort focused on preserving as much normal family life as possible. Yet some changes could not be hidden. George understood that people would now look at him differently. Charlotte sensed that ordinary conversations at school had become impossible. Louis recognized only that more security officers now surrounded the family wherever they went. Outside the palace, the nation debated constitutional history, succession, and royal tradition. Inside Windsor, however, William and Catherine concentrated on something much simpler. They were trying to protect 3 children whose lives had been permanently changed by decisions made in the name of the crown. Despite every security measure introduced by the palace, there were limits to what any royal household could control. Official statements could be managed, confidential documents could be protected, and palace staff could be instructed to remain silent. But no institution, regardless of its influence, could stop information from spreading through mobile phones, classrooms, conversations, or social media. Once the declaration entered the public domain, it developed a life of its own. George experienced that reality sooner than anyone had hoped. One morning, he walked quietly into the family kitchen carrying a tablet in his hands. The screen displayed headlines announcing his new position, accompanied by photographs and speculation about his future. Without saying a word, he placed the device on the table and looked toward his parents. Then he asked a question that neither William nor Catherine had fully prepared to answer. Why did millions of people learn about my future before I had the chance to understand it myself? The room fell silent. William gently explained that every decision had been made with one purpose: to protect him. The declaration, he said, had been intended to secure George's future before circumstances beyond their control could shape it differently. George listened respectfully. When he finally replied, his words were remarkably calm. If this was protection, he said softly, why does it feel like strangers know more about my life than I do? His answer struck far deeper than criticism. It revealed the emotional cost of decisions made by adults acting with the best intentions, but without fully considering how those choices might feel to the child at their center. Elsewhere in the house, Catherine faced a different conversation. Charlotte had become increasingly unsettled after hearing classmates discuss George's new title. Although she understood little about constitutional matters, she feared something much simpler. Would her brother now be separated from her and Louis? Would royal duty gradually replace ordinary family life? Catherine embraced her daughter and assured her that no title, however important, could ever change the relationships they shared as a family. George would always remain her brother. Yet as she spoke those comforting words, Catherine privately wondered whether time itself might eventually create the very distance she was promising would never exist. She knew how demanding royal responsibility could become. Titles never changed love, but they often changed daily life. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles watched the official confirmation broadcast in silence. For the first time, he viewed the story not as a constitutional development, but through the eyes of his grandson. Without hesitation, he contacted Windsor. When George answered the call, Charles chose not to speak about history, monarchy, or duty. Instead, he offered something far more personal. He apologized. The king told George he was sorry that the burden of royal expectation had arrived before anyone had truly prepared him to carry it. No child, Charles admitted, should first encounter the weight of the crown through headlines and public attention. George listened quietly. When the conversation ended, Charles remained thoughtful. He realized that the institution had once again repeated a familiar mistake. Too often, constitutional necessity had moved faster than personal understanding. Meanwhile, Princess Anne continued investigating the circumstances surrounding the leak. During an official security review, new evidence emerged indicating that copies of the emergency declaration had circulated within parts of the sovereign's household before the confidential meeting had even taken place. The discovery suggested that someone had deliberately attempted to expose the decision before William could announce it under controlled conditions. The implications were serious. During a private briefing, Queen Camilla was informed of the individual considered most likely to have been responsible. She listened carefully. Then she surprised everyone. Rather than using the information to strengthen her position against William, she refused to pursue the matter. Watching George, Charlotte, and Louis struggle with the consequences of the leak had changed her perspective. Another political confrontation might satisfy adults. It would only create more hardship for the children. That evening, after much of the palace had settled into silence, George approached his father with an unusual request. He wanted to speak privately, not as crown prince, not as the future heir, simply as a son who wanted honest answers from his father. The most important conversation surrounding the declaration would not occur inside council chambers or constitutional meetings. It would take place quietly, without advisors, officials, or royal ceremony. George had listened patiently while adults discussed his duty, his future, his security, and his responsibilities. Now he wanted the opportunity to explain how those decisions felt from his own perspective. Before William entered the room, George made one request: no advisors, no prepared statements, no one explaining what he was supposed to think or feel. Catherine immediately understood why. She remained nearby but quietly allowed father and son the privacy they needed. George deserved the chance to speak freely without anyone protecting him from his own emotions. As William walked into the room, he prepared himself for the possibility that George might reject the title completely. If necessary, he was ready to suspend its public use, even if doing so created another difficult confrontation with Buckingham Palace. By now, Crown Prince of Britain had become much more than a ceremonial designation. It represented a formal constitutional role that could influence nearly every aspect of George's future. George invited his father to sit beside him instead of across the room. The simple gesture immediately transformed the conversation. They were no longer speaking as future sovereign and future heir. They were speaking as father and son. George broke the silence first. He explained that he did not want strangers making decisions about his future. But neither did he want fear making those decisions. William listened carefully. Behind those thoughtful words, he recognized maturity that had arrived much earlier than any child should have needed to develop. Then came the question William had quietly feared. Why was everything signed before anyone told me the truth? William did not attempt to hide behind royal duty or constitutional necessity. He admitted that he had acted quickly because he feared the palace would assume greater control over George's future before he and Catherine could protect him. Looking back, however, he now understood something he had overlooked. His determination to prevent others from making decisions had unintentionally left George feeling excluded from decisions about his own life. William apologized sincerely. He acknowledged that, in trying to protect his son, he had confused parental responsibility with complete parental control. Protection, he admitted, should never come at the cost of trust. He then made George several promises. The title would never be used to silence his opinions. It would never separate him from Charlotte or Louis. It would never transform his childhood into a carefully managed program directed by officials rather than family. George listened for a long moment before giving his own answer. He agreed to accept the responsibilities connected to the title, but he established conditions that mattered deeply to him. He wanted school to remain a normal part of his life. He wanted time with his brother and sister to remain protected. He wanted family traditions to continue unchanged whenever possible. Most importantly, he wanted the freedom to make personal choices as he grew older, instead of having every step determined by palace expectations. George also rejected the idea of creating an independent royal household devoted solely to him. He did not want a separate court that isolated him from the rest of his family, nor did he wish to receive treatment that suggested he stood above Charlotte or Louis within their home. William smiled quietly. For the first time since the declaration had been signed, he understood that protecting George's future did not simply mean defending the institution. It also meant preserving the person who might one day lead it. That night, father and son reached an understanding that no constitutional document could ever provide. The crown might shape George's destiny, but together, they would ensure it never took away his childhood, his family, or his voice. William quietly lifted the official folder containing the declaration from the table. For several moments he looked at it without speaking, fully aware that the document represented months of planning, difficult choices, and painful family divisions. Then he set it aside and placed a simple blank notebook in front of George. The gesture was deliberate. "This," William said gently, "is where your future truly begins." He explained that the rules guiding George's life would never again be written only by palace officials, constitutional advisors, or centuries of tradition. Instead, they would be shaped with George's voice included at every stage. His future would not simply be decided for him. He would grow into it with understanding, choice, and the support of those who loved him most. For the first time since the declaration had been signed, George smiled with quiet relief. When William and George left the room together, Catherine immediately sensed that something important had changed. She embraced her son, not because he had accepted a historic title, but because he had found the courage to express his fears and define the boundaries of his own future. The title remained, but now it would exist on terms that placed the child before the institution. William knew, however, that a much larger challenge still awaited him. He would now have to face King Charles, Queen Camilla, senior palace officials, and the nation itself, proving that George's voice deserved as much respect as centuries of royal tradition. By sunrise, events had moved beyond the palace. News organizations interrupted scheduled programming. Television networks opened continuous coverage. Newspapers redesigned their front pages before dawn. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds steadily gathered, reacting to reports that a remarkable constitutional decision had altered the preparation of Britain's future monarchy. Some celebrated. Others expressed concern. Many simply wanted reassurance that George's childhood would remain protected. Amid the growing public attention, one photograph unexpectedly changed the tone of the national conversation. It showed George walking beside Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, not ahead of them. William followed quietly a single step behind. The image carried a message more powerful than any official statement. Britain did not see only the future of the monarchy. It saw a family determined to keep that future grounded in ordinary love. Across the country, commentators began analyzing the significance of the declaration. Many described it as the most important adjustment to royal succession preparation in decades. They explained that succession preparation extended far beyond ceremonial appearances. It included education, constitutional instruction, security planning, diplomatic experience, and the gradual responsibilities expected of those destined to inherit the crown. Some observers praised William for introducing a more modern approach that placed family alongside duty. Others questioned whether his actions had shifted practical authority away from King Charles before the current reign had reached its natural conclusion. Recognizing the growing public debate, Buckingham Palace released a carefully worded statement. The announcement emphasized that George's new designation honored the long-term continuity of the monarchy while leaving the constitutional order of succession entirely unchanged. The statement reassured the public that no alteration had been made to the legal process determining who would eventually inherit the crown. Kensington Palace issued its own message shortly afterward. Rather than focusing on constitutional language, it addressed the questions many families across Britain were asking. George would remain at school. He would continue living with William, Catherine, Charlotte, and Louis. He would not move into a separate royal household. His daily life would remain centered on family, education, and normal childhood experiences wherever possible. The contrast between the two statements reflected the balance both households now sought to achieve. One protected the institution. The other protected the child. The following morning, newspapers throughout Britain featured George prominently on their front pages. One headline captured the public mood particularly well: "The boy carrying Britain's tomorrow." The accompanying article spoke less about privilege than responsibility. Photographs of George revealed not excitement but thoughtful uncertainty, a young boy trying to understand a future that had suddenly become the subject of national discussion. That image reshaped public opinion. The story was no longer viewed simply as a debate over constitutional authority. It had become the story of a child learning to carry expectations far beyond his years. Outside Buckingham Palace, supporters arrived carrying Union flags and messages of encouragement. Others placed handwritten letters and flowers along the gates. Many of those notes shared one common request: protect George's childhood. Among them, one message written by another young child quickly attracted widespread attention. "You can be brave and still be young." Those simple words spread rapidly through newspapers and television broadcasts because they expressed what official statements never could. They reminded the country that behind every royal title stood a child still growing up. Public opinion remained divided. Some believed William had acted wisely by strengthening the monarchy before another period of uncertainty emerged. Others argued that no constitutional safeguard justified placing such responsibility upon an 11-year-old through emergency measures. The nation found itself asking the very same question that had divided the royal family. Had the declaration provided protection, or had it unintentionally created new pressure disguised as duty? Inside Buckingham Palace, Charles watched coverage of the crowds alongside Queen Camilla. After several moments of reflection, the king quietly acknowledged something important. The people were not celebrating the weakening of his authority. They were asking whether the monarchy had finally learned from its own history. Camilla understood. Soon afterward, she approved a public statement expressing support for George while formally recognizing William and Catherine's primary responsibility for guiding his upbringing. It represented an important gesture toward reconciliation. George offered the nation his own quiet response without delivering a speech. During a family appearance at Windsor, he deliberately walked between Charlotte and Louis rather than ahead of them. When photographers called out his new title, George instinctively turned toward his brother and sister before acknowledging the cameras. That single moment reminded millions of people that family remained his first priority. Britain gradually accepted that history had entered a new chapter. Now only one question remained. Would King Charles embrace that change? The final family meeting took place inside Buckingham Palace. Once again, the declaration rested at the center of the table. 3 generations sat together: Charles, William, George. Alongside them were Catherine, Queen Camilla, and Princess Anne. Unlike previous discussions, this gathering was not intended to resolve constitutional disputes. Its purpose was simpler: to heal a family before lasting damage became impossible to repair. William spoke first. He explained that George had agreed to accept the responsibilities associated with his title only under clear conditions. His education would remain protected. His privacy would be respected. His family life would remain central. Most importantly, he would have the right to participate in shaping his own future. The title would represent preparation and continuity, not personal power. Charles rose slowly and walked across the room. Rather than standing above George, he chose to sit beside him. The king spoke quietly. The crown may ask for courage, it may ask for service, it may even ask for sacrifice. But it must never ask someone to stop being themselves. George looked toward his father. William immediately recognized that Charles was no longer resisting the declaration. He was helping define its meaning. The king then admitted something deeply personal. William had acted from fear, and the history of their family had given him understandable reasons to feel that fear. William answered with equal honesty. He acknowledged that his actions had unintentionally made Charles feel as though his reign had already been overshadowed. For the first time, neither father nor son attempted to win the argument. They simply listened. Queen Camilla then turned toward Catherine. She confirmed that she would respect the authority of the protected family council and would not interfere with its responsibilities. Catherine accepted those words graciously. She understood that genuine reconciliation required mutual respect rather than victory. Only after both women had finished speaking did Princess Anne address the room. She formally recorded the agreement, confirming that every commitment made during the meeting would become part of the official council record. Finally, King Charles signed the royal confirmation. The document gave formal recognition to George's title, while clearly defining its purpose. Preparation, protection, continuity. Nothing more, nothing less. The king then offered the pen to George. Instead of signing immediately, George quietly closed the presentation case and handed it to William. The gesture carried a simple but powerful meaning. He would never carry the responsibility alone. When the meeting ended, the future had become clearer. Princess Anne remained guardian of the succession framework. William and Catherine retained full parental authority. Queen Camilla withdrew from George's preparation council. Every unauthorized schedule involving George was cancelled. The declaration had never been about ending Charles's reign or placing a crown upon George too soon. Instead, it had forced the monarchy to embrace a lesson generations had struggled to learn. Preparing a future sovereign should never require sacrificing the childhood of the person expected to become one. The emergency declaration began as a struggle over authority. It ended as a promise. This time, the crown would be carried by a family standing together, not by a child standing alone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal update. We'll see you in the next video.